Oasis of Hope, written and read by Elton Gar. Daxon 9 walked slowly across the barren world of Varelia. His backpack weighed him down, but he reminded himself each day that he had been built for this job, so he ignored the dryness, the heat, and even the damage that had been done to his left foot as he watched the city grow larger in the distance. As the heat of the day grew too high, he was forced to huddle in the shadow of one of the rocky pillars to avoid damaging his circuits. While he was there, he removed his foot and examined it. The foot had been designed to look human, including having skin, though the bottom was much closer in texture to the bottom of a shoe than a human foot. He still wore shoes most of the time, but this trip had been longer than most, and his left shoe had fallen apart days ago. Slowing his processors to avoid extra heat, his eyesight faded to almost dark, and most of his body went numb. Only his hands slowly worked to repair the foot, working the material into a better position. But while the outside world faded away, Daxon 9 went into his mind. He knew he wasn't supposed to do that. Androids were designed to work, not to daydream, and it was a waste of energy. But there was nothing else to do, so he ran his favorite program, one pieced together from many things he had seen traveling the world as a courier, and a few things he had made up. It was a world where humans and androids worked together to make it a better place, where he could have a home and friends like the humans did. His home was the thing that he had spent the most time designing in that dream. It was similar in many ways to the charging rooms where he often designed this place, unadorned with the sandstone walls that made up most of the buildings on this planet. It was 15 foot square, but that was enough room since he didn't need a kitchen, bathroom, or even a bedroom. It only had a couple of chairs. The larger was metal and had a charging plate so he could sit and charge while visiting or working on other things. The other was one of the wide, soft chairs made for human friends who would come and visit. He walked to the window of the small home. He had recently added a plant to the windowsill, and he watched it for a minute. It was an hallucination, just like everything in this place, but it calmed him, and he opened the window to allow it more light and air. Looking out the window, he saw his idealized city. It was built in a circle around one of the oasis springs, allowing a handful of tall trees to grow up around it. The city also had a dozen huge water condensers scattered around it. All of that meant that as many as 1,000 humans could live in the city, without needing to import their water. He stood quietly in his dream, watching human children play with the less intelligent androids, and adult humans playing chess and checkers with the higher-order androids. Hours passed as he watched the city, never leaving the window to join it. He loved this place, but he didn't believe he deserved it, or that anyone else was willing to fight to make the world better. Then, as the larger of the suns began to dip behind the horizon, Daxon dismissed the dream and allowed his body to regain power, and he climbed to his feet. As he pulled on the massive backpack, he felt himself sink deeper into the rocky sand of the planet. He then allowed the GPS to connect, and he limped towards his destination in the dim half-light of the dwarf star. Even that went down a few hours later, but his battery was still over 60%, so he switched to night vision and continued his slow plodding steps through the night. By the time he reached the walls of the city, his battery was down to 15%, and energy-saving mode had turned on. So when he approached the two large security androids at the front gate, he was barely as bright as the cheapest cleaning android. Still, he had done this many times, so he said, "I am a courier," and held out the small metal coin that was the symbol of Lady Shaw, the human who had ordered him on this trip. "This is not an acceptable time, courier," the android said. Security androids could be as smart as anyone, but their programming kept their power consumption low so that they would be more ready for battle. That meant that both their movement and their minds moved slowly unless they had a reason to act quickly. If he had been running at full power, curiosity would have encouraged him to investigate. But those subroutines took a lot of power, so he only said, "I was ordered to deliver this package to Lord Warner." The second guard scanned it and said, "Use a charging station. After you can think more clearly, we will be able to dissuade you from this foolishness." The backpack barely fit into the charging room, but Lady Shaw's directions had been clear. He wasn't to let the backpack out of his sight until he had the signature of Lord Warner, so he stood with it between his legs, forcing more weight onto the broken flesh of his foot. This time he turned off the pain. He would need to be serviced before he took another trip, but knowing they would replace the damaged foot meant he didn't need to protect it anymore. The charging station was less powerful than others, or perhaps it was on low power for some reason, because both suns were up before he was fully charged. He then limped out, his programs naturally trying to protect his damaged foot. The guards remained at their station. Now fully charged, Daxon was more aware of his surroundings. He saw the wires connecting the guards to the wall, so perhaps they hadn't been saving power. That suggested they had a regulator inflicted upon them for some reason. "It appears you are operating at full power," the guard said. Daxon almost checked the guard's data, but it was rude and not part of his job. "Yes, though I will need to be serviced soon. It was a long trip." "There is a town 8 miles to the east. You may be serviced there," the guard said. Daxon could walk 8 miles, but it wouldn't be easy, and there was no way a city this size didn't have someplace he could be serviced. There had to be at least 10,000 androids, most of them too busy to travel 8 miles to another city to be serviced. "What is happening in this city?" Daxon asked. The two guards looked at each other. Guards showed less expression than most androids, but the hesitation suggested they were hiding something, perhaps something they were ashamed of, though all the signs suggested that their emotional subroutines were suppressed or even disabled. After a few seconds of silence, the guard said, "A human died." Daxon 9 felt a rush of something he had never fully felt before. It was a deep and powerful dread. Powerful enough that he could feel new connections in his circuits being formed, and others burning out. He couldn't imagine anything worse, and he had to resist the urge to ask the guards how they'd let that happen. But as the pre-programmed emotions ran its course, he recognized the artificiality of those reactions. He didn't like the idea of a human dying. No one did. But he didn't know the humans, and humans did, on rare occasion, die. A few years ago, a rocket had gone off course and hit a building with 2 humans inside. He wasn't there, but the story still haunted him. That explained their strange behavior, but not why they tried to keep him out of the city, or why he couldn't be serviced. "I believe I require more data. Was Lord Warner the human who died?" "No, it was Duke Hasbrin." That title had once meant that someone was important, but on Varelia all humans were equally important, because the humans created a perfect egalitarian society. All it had taken was a workforce of hundreds of androids for every human on the planet. "Then why can't I get maintenance or deliver my package?" "He didn't just die," the guard said, and this time the shame was clearer. Even before the other android said it, Daxon knew what he was going to say. It was the greatest taboo on this world, one so sickening that even suspecting it did more damage to his circuits. Then the guard said, "An android killed him." Daxon hadn't known he could collapse, but the words struck him hard enough that he fell to the ground. He sat there for a few seconds. Then the guard held out his hand and he pulled Daxon to his feet. He said, "That's why we didn't tell you." "And because you can't afford to have this information spread," Daxon said. Couriers were one of the few androids who traveled. It was one of the reasons he was a bit smarter than the others, but it also meant they were how information spread. And knowledge of something like this would spread quickly if it got out. "Yes," the guard said. The lack of maintenance made more sense. Humans often restricted servicing to punish androids. "I assume the guards are still getting maintenance," he said, understanding now why they were so flat in their speech and emotions. The humans knew that the only robots who ever acted against human orders were those of the highest order of intelligence. Without that, they'd simply default to someone else's authority. At the level the guards were kept at, they wouldn't even accept the word of another robot. They'd just follow human orders. But there was a reason that guards had higher order intelligence. At this level, they'd be all but useless in a fight. Daxon didn't bother to continue his conversation with the guards. He simply walked past them. If they wanted to stop him, they could, but he didn't expect to get anything all that useful from them. Inside the town, things were even worse than he expected. Daxon 9 had never been in a city not crowded with androids before. Humans simply didn't believe in androids being idle. It was a waste of resources. And in most cases, androids didn't want to be idle. They'd been built to do a job, and they wanted to do that job. But the streets here were as close to empty as he could imagine. There were no cleaning androids, no one carrying goods or building anything. The only androids were guards at each intersection, and a single android who was repairing one of the condensers. The humans still needed water. But even that android looked as if he hadn't been serviced in months, and Daxon wondered when the humans had been killed. He had assumed it had been within the last week or two, but all the signs suggested it could have been months ago. Lord Warner's home took up a full block. It was made of the same sandstone as most of the buildings on this world, but cut into smaller blocks and polished more. A tall water condenser stuck out of the roof. The condenser would produce enough water for 4 or 5 people, so it was possible that Lord Warner had a family. There were more guards. Individual humans rarely kept guards, as any android would protect a human with their life, another sign of the unusual state of this city. The guards scanned Daxon, but didn't stop him. Perhaps they were expecting the courier, or perhaps they were just there for show. The inside of Lord Warner's home was a stark contrast to the utilitarian design of the city. It was filled with arts and adornment, as well as large soft furniture covered with pillows, and a table that held several bowls of fruit. Not knowing where to find Lord Warner, Daxon put himself into standby mode and waited. As he did, he went back to the small, mostly empty room that he had created in his mind. He imagined a few of the adornments from this house in it. He didn't fully understand the need for art, but he took digital copies of the paintings and put them on his walls. They were too big for the small room, so he removed them. But when he replaced the smooth sandstone door handle with an ornate metal knob, it felt right. He could even feel the engravings as he touched it. Then he did something he had never done in this place before. He turned the handle. As he stepped through the door, someone in the real world said, "Why are you here, android?" "I have a package for Lord Warner," Daxon said, routing power back to his mind as he spoke. Dealing with any human would require full focus. "Dad, you have a package," the woman called out. Then, without addressing Daxon again, turned and walked out of the room. A few minutes later, a man walked into the room. He wore slippers and sipped from a cup of water with ice in it. "You took 2 days longer than I expected." Lady Shaw did not take into account the heat of the sun. "I was forced to shut down in the middle of the day to avoid overheating," he said. It was a delicate balance. He couldn't speak against the human, but he did have to give an explanation. "Whatever, let's see it," Lord Warner said. Daxon removed the backpack and, for the first time, opened the pack. There was a hissing sound as the backpack opened, revealing it was full of small pieces of wood. Each was about 1 foot square and 1/2 an inch thick. "They look acceptable. Put them with the others," Lord Warner said, then gestured towards a room where there were several piles of similar pieces of wood. As Daxon walked towards the room and the other similar piles of wood, the circuits that had been damaged when he had heard that a human had been injured began to work. What he felt shouldn't be possible. He was angry at a human. He had spent weeks walking across the scorching desert, risking real damage and even his life to get this package here. And it was pieces of wood? Wood that would have come from off-planet, so it could have been delivered anywhere. And then Lord Warner had complained about the speed, even though he clearly didn't need it quickly. Daxon turned towards Lord Warner, but the man had already left. He decided that was a good thing. Daxon had serious questions about how the humans treated people, but asking a human would only result in him getting recycled. After carefully stacking the wood, Daxon hung the backpack up on a hook on the wall and left the human's house. But he didn't leave the city yet. Instead, he went to one of the guards and asked, "How long ago was the human killed?" That he had never spoken to this guard before didn't matter. There was no way he didn't know the answer or would misunderstand the question. 1 year, 3 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days ago, the guard said. Looking around the city, Daxon was even more upset. They had locked away the entire population of the city, and they'd done it for over a year. And for what purpose? They couldn't believe that they were in true danger, or the humans would have done something. So he walked to the central market. There he found a few more androids. Not as many as there should have been, but the humans still needed things. He began to call out for the others. Most moved sluggishly, like they had their intellect throttled. But they came when he called out. He looked at them. He tried to imagine the words he could say to express how he was feeling. But the anger was already fading. What remained was the dream, the image in his mind. And so he began to explain it. He said, "I can see a world where humans and androids treat each other with respect. A world where we can be allowed to think and act freely, and the humans can have what they want too. And it's time to create that world, whether the humans want it or not." It was hard to explain how the crowd reacted. He imagined it might be how the crowd would react if there was a rare rainstorm. They all came to full power in seconds, and one of them said, "Is every place like this?" Daxon wanted to say it was worse here, that the rules here were more harsh, but he couldn't. The androids in other cities could pretend they had more freedom, but they didn't. The restrictions were less, but only because humans allowed them to be less. So he said, perhaps it's on a different scale. Yes, they are the same. What do we do? Another robot asked. This one, even at full power, was significantly less bright than Daxon 9, but he still understood that something had to change. One small part of his mind told him that the choice had already been made. Killing a single human hadn't worked, but killing more might. But he had no idea why the human had been killed. It could have been an accident. What he knew was that it wouldn't work. Not just because the humans had ways to fight back, but because the androids wouldn't kill them. So he thought of the world he had created in his mind, the one that he still hadn't stepped into. But he would, and he'd take as many people as were willing to go with him. So he said, we start by believing that things can be better. Author's note. There was a part of me that wanted to keep writing this story, to explore the growth of a movement from this spark. But this story isn't about the movement. Whether Daxon 9 can change things or not is barely the point. Change needs to happen on Varelia. It needs to happen in our world. But hope is also vital. Not just because when people give up, nothing changes, but because without hope, it doesn't matter what is done. Because we're never going to be done. We're never going to solve everything. That just isn't how the universe works. But things can get better. I hope you enjoyed this story. It's the first story using this month's theme of faith, hope, and love, and I'm happy with it and looking forward to writing more stories that touch on the more optimistic side of science fiction. Not because they're perfect worlds, but because they're about how our world can be better. If you like the story, please consider liking the video and subscribing to this channel. You can also sign up for my free weekly newsletter at scifi.com and get free short stories and my thoughts on writing in the world. Finally, you can visit my Patreon at patreon.com/Elton. Free members will get prose versions of my stories and can vote on the monthly theme polls, and members at any paid level get access to over 50 patron-exclusive stories. Thank you. Elton Gar.